Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. I am JM, and this is a show where we sit around and we talk about gaming. We think about it, we dissect it, we review it, we look at it in what I hope are interesting and meaningful ways, because I think that gaming is beautiful. It's something that provides beauty to our lives and our world. It fosters empathy, creativity. It creates culture, and it creates community. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. So bear with me. Today we're starting a series that I've wanted to do for a while, and thanks to discussions with Ben and Tink and several others, getting some pushback and refining, we're going to stumble our way through a series known as role-playing games as the Mythic Gateway. And so today, in the first part of this series, we're kind of defining our terms. We're talking about why to even do this, and kind of what do I mean and why do I think we need this Mythic Gateway. So a quote that I use very often is from Greg Stafford, the discoverer of Glorantha and designer of Pendragon. He said, role-playing activates a critical human process that has been nearly killed by over-rationalization and materialism. Role-playing is a way for humans to interact with our deep, hidden, mythological selves. They're a way to feed our souls. And I use that quote a lot. It's a North Star for me. It's a guiding light. But what does that actually mean? And that's kind of what I'm hoping to talk about over this next 4 to 5 part series that we're going to be doing on Behind the Screen. Now, before we can get to that, we kind of have to understand what killed this process. And what is this process? And so what I think this process is, what he's talking about, is that mythology, the understanding of how we relate to each other and to the supernatural reality of our world, was the basis of culture. It's, if you play RuneQuest, right, your community is built around two things: families and beliefs. The cult forms the core of this. Now, I'm not going to talk about any specific religion or mythology in this, just the necessity that we have to have that as human beings. There's a hole in us that requires this connection to a mythological reality. And we live in a culture where that has been largely killed, and I think killed by 3 giants at the gate. And we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about materialism, we're going to talk about deconstructionism, and we're going to talk about post-modernism. We're going to start with post-modernism first. Now, this is an idea put forth by a French sociologist and philosopher, Jean Baudrillard. I'm hoping I pronounced that name correctly. And basically, he broke up the whole of human history into 3 large movements. Everything before the Industrial Revolution was what we would call the pre-modern mind. And the grand narrative of the pre-modern mind, no matter where you were in the world, came back to the idea of mythology. And when I say mythology, I don't mean a post-enlightenment, fake stories that unenlightened people talked before, we understood the world. No, that's BS. Just because they didn't have the ability to fly, or science as we know it, doesn't mean that the pre-modern man was somehow idiotic when it came to these things. Mythologies, as Lewis and Tolkien defined them, are stories about how men relate to men and how men relate to the divine. With that definition, Christianity is a myth. In fact, Tolkien called it the truest myth, the silver myth, if you will. So, and what do I mean by the grand narrative? Well, the grand narrative was everything about culture tied back to that. And culture being art and beauty. So, music, paintings, sculptures, plays, theater, musicals, opera, these were all focused in and around the grand narrative of our past, this mythological narrative that tried to answer the deep philosophical questions. That's what culture does. Who am I? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to interact with my community? And so all culture in the pre-modern world was this one thread, this one grand narrative along the arcs of local religion and myth. And it tried to answer those questions. It tried to tell us, hey, this is what's important, and this is why it's important. And Baudrillard said that at this point, what we had was all of these people were making simulacra, things that they had seen first or experienced firsthand. They drew landscapes because they went out and saw landscapes. They went out and they drew people or sculpted people because they interacted with people. They recreated scenes from their texts because they were reading their texts. But they were all simulacra. They were not the real thing. They were clearly culture and art. The second big sweeping move is this tiny little piece in the middle called modernism. And modernism is basically what happens when the Industrial Revolution hits and we move from simulacra into what he called simulation. Because we suddenly were able to videotape, take photography first, and then we moved into visual mediums. And suddenly we were not recreating something, we were able to capture moments in time. That changed how culture worked. Suddenly, we weren't limited by our local or our own narrative. We were able to be exposed to narratives throughout the world. We were able to be exposed to narratives in almost real time, which, take a look at the difference between, say, World War II, the Vietnam and Korean War, to see the effects on a community when they are getting all of this real time. Yes, reality versus representations of reality take. Yes, Padre, that is one of my... I love Lewis's thoughts on all of this. But Baudrillard postulated or foresaw the arising of what he called postmodernism. And this is where we get to talk about social media, which I realize that I am on talking to you all about. But his point was that eventually culture would be created at such an intense rate, at such a fantastical rate, and be so integrated into everything that we do that we would enter into a state of hyper-reality. Memes are as real to us as the trees outside. They are a part of our daily life. Your social media is a part of your reality. What you consume on the television, the streaming on YouTube and Twitch is part of our reality. But it's not a real part of reality. It's a simulation of a simulation. There's this vast web of what they call intertextuality. It's why Family Guy can make jokes about Star Wars and no one needs to pause and re-look that up. Yes, Ben, this is where the existential dread comes in. Now imagine, instead of one grand narrative, you now have dozens, hundreds, thousands of cultural narratives being thrown in your face every second of every day, trying to tell you the answers to who you are. What does it mean to be human? What does love mean and look like? Just take that last one. Whether you're watching The Bachelorette, Temptation Island, Love is Blind, you're going to get 3 different views of what love means. Another part of postmodernism is the fact that modernism had this belief, pre-modernism had this thing, hey, myths are true. They tell us about our place in the world. We look up. Modernism says we can dissect everything and we can put it in its proper place, and there's an objective reality separate from this mythic reality. Postmodernism denies all of that. Is it any wonder that, as Ben just pointed out, that it can be overwhelming to think about? It's fractured. It's chaos. We no longer have a grand narrative to help us work through and answer these questions. And most importantly, we don't have a framework for what to do when things go wrong or feel bad. Because in this hyper reality, we are only seeing the most polished, the most seductive, the most targeted versions of reality. All right, so take all of that, set that aside for a second. That's what postmodernism is and means. I promise, by the end of this series, they're all going to make a lot more sense. Closely linked with that is the idea of deconstructionism. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm glad you asked, dear viewer. Deconstructionism is linked heavily with postmodernism, and it's the idea that there is no objective reality, and we should take it apart to really see. It's a challenge to the attempt to establish an objective reality. In literature, which is where I'm most familiar with, it's the idea that, hey, we shouldn't use tropes just because they're tropes. Let's break them apart and see why they work. Descartes is kind of a, Descartism, right? He said, I'm going to take everything out of my philosophical basket and establish a bedrock piece and then examine each piece as I put it back. And he gets to, right, I think, therefore I am. Deconstructionism can lead to wonderful stories. All-Star Superman is a deconstruction of Superman. Like, what are each of the parts of the Silver Age Superman and why are they important? But then put back in a very careful way. I would argue that in comic books, the deconstruction that Alan Moore and Dave Gibbon put out in Watchmen is a beautiful deconstruction of what it would actually look like to be superheroes. And of course, in the fantasy genre, my favorite deconstructionist is Steven Erikson. The Malazan Books of the Fallen rip apart every fantasy trope and lovingly put them back together for a purpose. And I think that's the key. C.S. Lewis said in An Experiment in Criticism that the best critics, we used to understand that being critical of something required that you loved it deeply. You loved it deeply enough to see past your love and to see it truly, warts and all, and to point out the warts from a place of love. And that the worst possible thing would be for critics who love the subject to be replaced by people who just hate things professionally. It's a good thing that didn't happen. I think, honestly, the two worst examples of deconstruction, I am willing to fight you on this, are The Song of Ice and Fire and The Last Jedi. I don't believe that Martin loves fantasy, nor do I believe that Rian Johnson loves Star Wars. I think they just like to tear things apart and kick the pieces around on the ground because it's interesting. I watched a very interesting video saying that Martin's probably never going to finish his books, which I agree. And he said, but his point was Martin has deconstructed the fantasy completely. There are no heroes, because heroes are just lies that are told about people. There's no such thing as prophecy, so there's no hope that a savior will come for you. There's no such thing as religion. It's just a way to control the masses. And, oh crap, why am I writing this story? Right, there's nothing redeeming there. There's no moral, there's no point, there's nothing to be gained by finishing the story, and I can't argue with that. Rian Johnson's Star Wars deconstructed itself so much and subverted its own expectations that I think it came out of its own ass and subverted its original premise. Right? Anyone can be a Jedi. You don't need Luke Skywalker. Anyone could have done it. Except for the fact that the end of the movie goes, yeah, but only Luke Skywalker could do this. So deconstruction has moved from a tool of criticism from people who love things to a tool of people who hate things professionally. And coming back to gaming, man, you don't have to spend more than about 30 seconds on social media to find very loud and very vocal people who are making their living hating gaming. Whether it's one part or another or the whole thing, deconstructionism has allowed hate to tear apart the things that we love. And last but not least, materialism. This idea that only the physical things that we can interact with our five senses are the only things that matter. We used to have fairy tales that warned us about materialism. Now we have advertising that says, hey, this stuff's awesome. You need more of it. And these are the three giants at the gates, constantly battering at our psyche and our soul and our minds through every outlet that we have. Streaming, movies, novels, social media. And I would argue that social media is like Rhode Island, which is neither a road nor an island. While it is media, content, and sadly culture, because it attempts to answer all of the important questions to us, it's not social. It's designed specifically kind of to isolate and sell you things. You are the product in social media. Yes, Ben, I would assume that materialism is the father of consumerism, right? Watch Mad Men for the rise of advertising. They did a much better job than I will. And so all of this leaves us kind of bereft. We have no clear way to engage with the things that we used to go to find answers for the big questions. We have no good place of catharsis to deal with when bad things happen in our lives, right? One of the beautiful ways that the Iliad was used, Dr. Batistas talks about this in his books, The Ethics of Beauty, is that the Iliad was used as catharsis for Greek soldiers coming back from the brutality of war. My buddy Josh, who used to do the Grand Campaign with me, talks about how the Iliad was written not when Greek was winning, but when Greek was on the losing end of a number of wars. That's when Homer composited the Iliad. The Iliad is this beautiful myth, but it talks to both sides as if they're the heroes and the villains. You can read the Iliad and you can empathize with both sides at various points. You can love the same character in one chapter and hate them in the next. It provides pathos. It provides catharsis. It provides redemption. And with those three giants at the gates, postmodernism, deconstructionism, materialism, Greg Stafford years ago said, hey, the thing that we have to combat this is role-playing games. That's what I'm going to talk about over the next 3 to 5 episodes. How do role-playing games create a culture? How do role-playing games push back against the idea that only what I can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell have value? How can they help us deal with what to do when things go wrong? Now, how do I put this? I am in no way suggesting that role-playing games are therapy. Your DM may be a therapist, as I said before, but should not be your therapist. And I think the fact that we have put that role on dungeon masters is one of the key reasons for burnout. A lot of people talk about burnout, and most of the time they're focused on, well, is it because you're prepping too much? Is it because you're not prepping enough? Is it because you're not doing all of these things? It's because you're not doing just a little bit of these things. I think for me, the reason I don't suffer GM burnout is because of this mythological renewal of my soul every time I come to the gaming table. It revitalizes me, it energizes me, it focuses me, it helps me connect with people and a community. And that's the last thing. How does RPG foster culture and community? So I realize this might have been a deep dive here at the beginning. Some heavy topics. I can hear Michael J. Fox in the back of my head going heavy. But there's nothing wrong with the Earth's gravitational pull here in the future. What I wanted to do was say, hey, here are the giants at the gates. Here's why they can be so damaging to us. Why we so deeply need beauty in our lives. And for me, role-playing games are only one source of beauty. I find beauty in my relationships. I find beauty in art. I find beauty in the traditions that I'm a part of. But this is a show about gaming, so I'm going to keep coming back to that. And I think that role-playing games are not just the walls and the gates. Or they can be much more than just the walls and the gates against these giants. They could be the soldiers and the ballistas on the wall of our friends, our tables, our communities, and ourselves. So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 3 or 4 episodes. And in the middle, I'll do a review and unboxing of Necessary Evil, which is on its way to me. That includes the Suede versions of Necessary Evil, Breakout, Cosmic Crisis, and a little adventure called The Return of Dr. Destruction that I happen to be very, very excited about. So Tink said, social media creates anti-myths in direct opposition with the purpose of catharsis, self-discovery, and the affirmation of values. Tink did her dissertation on digital media and postmodernism. Yes, and what's interesting to me is going back to this idea of materialism, one of the great foundational stories for role-playing games, the Call of Cthulhu stories by H.P. Lovecraft, they're anti-myth. They're not actually mythology. We call them a mythos. And I think it's funny because Lovecraft, in his very humanist material attempt, was trying to provide an anti-mythos to the world, and yet could not help but fall into the trappings of mythological reality, which is why these stories still stick with us. Even Chaosium refers to Call of Cthulhu as the anti-myth, but I would argue that the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, by placing the players in the role of the investigators and not the cultists, makes the game heroic and mythic. Homer. Yes, John. We should do a Homer Simpson recites the Iliad and do like a Homerized version of it. A Homerized version of Homer. Wow, that would be amazing. Theater of War took this idea and ran with it. They would do readers' theater presentations of Greek plays and use them to start a conversation with veterans over their war experience. Yes! Like the fact that you have the book Achilles in Vietnam, the fact that you have all of these realizations that there is a need to process and have this release, this painful, sorrowful release of the burdens and the grief that we carry. And the problem that we have kind of in this postmodern hyperreality is this overwhelming desire to always put forth only your best face. It's actually why one of the reasons why the Surgeon General is putting warnings on social media for young people, especially young girls, because all you are getting is this simulation. But when you look at the simulation and compare it to your reality, that gulf can be devastating and deeply wounding. That's because we have the John Hive mind, John Doom. All right, Ben said the discourse on social media around the Olympic opening following the chaos of the election makes it abundantly clear that social media is chaos. It's hard to feel like it's about 97% gaslighting and we can't even tell until someone turns it to 11. Yes, Ben, this hyper reality means that we have 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 different truths being spoken to us from 100,000 different angles. The idea of fake news doesn't shock me, because amidst those voices, there can't all be true. And I don't want to get into discussion of like politics or social media. I just had to establish the giants at the gates. And now hopefully I'm going to give us tools through gaming that will help us defend ourselves, those that we love, those that we play with, in the face of these three giants. Corn is the internet, John. I would say corn is embodied in most Twitter discussions. I don't think we need to discuss what portions of the internet belong to Slanesh. Probably memes are the province of Father Nurgle because they replicate like diseases. We call them going viral. And who does that leave us? Tzeentch is the changer of ways, and yeah, I feel like it is the embodiment of all four of the Chaos Gods, as well as the Horned Rat, who is creating all of these intertextual and interlinking hyperlinks between the Warrens of the world. So, on that super funny note to the end of a depressing intro story, I hope you'll journey with me as we talk about this, because I truly believe beauty will save the world. I keep saying that. I may have to follow in my pastor's in Colorado's footsteps and get it tattooed on my arm so I never forget it. But we'll end here. That's the end of today's foundation of RPGs as a mythic gateway. Tuesday, we're going to cover RPGs as culture and go from there. So, thank you to everybody who showed up in the chat and hanging out. Thank you to everybody who has joined our membership on YouTube. I greatly appreciate that. To everybody who's been a patron of the Iconic production, thank you so much. Like, you guys help me keep the lights on. Had to replace a couple of things here that I get to do because of your guys' support. And it's truly humbling that we can come and hang out and talk about fun things, but also deep and weighty things. So, until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, please stay gaming. I am JM. This has been Behind the Screen, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Till then, have a good one.